Welcome to Teaching 8th Grade U.S. History. This is session 10, if you can believe it. This is our final session of the year. And we are actually probably going to go through today's session a little more quickly, and you'll see why. It's a pretty short unit, and it's really a chance for students to wrap up and synthesize their learning for the year as they look forward into high school. So without further ado, let's get started. That is the bit.ly link for this slide deck. So if you'd like to take a look, feel free to enter that and you can follow along. So I am Molly Gale. I am one of the social studies consultants at Oakland Schools, and my two colleagues who are not with me tonight, but I want to give them a shout out, are Stacy Woodward and Christopher Lee. So this is the graphic organizer for the final unit in the 8th grade MC3 course. I'm going to give you just a second to take a look at it. And just think about how you might use this with students. As you're thinking about that, I'll just point out, you'll notice that this unit is asking students to look at change over time from 1800 until 1898. And they're really taking a look at some big topics. So they're looking at territory, treatment of African Americans, population, transportation. You'll see there's a lot of things here they're going to trace over time and look at what has changed or perhaps not changed over the course of the 1800s. So at this point in the year, students have worked their way through 9 units, and Unit 9 was really a deep dive on Reconstruction. Unit 10 is the final unit of the course, and you'll see it's also quite a short unit. In fact, it's only 1 week, so coming off of units that have all been longer than that, this is a very short unit, and it's a chance to wrap up the year, to give kids a chance to look back and think about what they've learned. And then finally to look forward into high school, into some of the topics they're going to investigate at the beginning of that U.S. history course. So Unit 10, I always like to give you a little bit of framing for the unit. The compelling question for this unit is 19th century America a story of progress? And again, students are looking at almost the entire 1800s, ending in 1898. So some things we were thinking about as we prepared to create this unit. First and foremost on our mind was this standard. So standard U 6.1.1 in 8th grade is a pretty big one. So as you're looking at it, you'll notice it asks students to compare and contrast the United States in 1800 with the United States in 1898, focusing on similarities and differences in each of these different areas. The standards examples are helpful in as well here, and you'll notice that for each of these, there is an example or multiple examples of what students could look at as they're looking at similarities and differences between 1800 and 1898. So this was definitely at the top of our mind as we created this unit, thinking about how we could have students meaningfully address this standard, and definitely to bring in many of these different examples, and doing that all, of course, within a week's time. So we wanted to wrap up the course in a meaningful way. We're going to have kids really have a chance to synthesize their learning, to look at patterns that they had been investigating over the course of the 19th century, and to make claims about change over time. In this case, looking at whether the U.S. had progressed, maybe whether it had regressed, or whether it had just stayed the same. We also wanted to prepare students to start thinking about key topics and themes that they will encounter at the start of high school U.S. history. And of course, the challenge of all of this is condensing it into 1 week. So here we go. I'm going to show you what came out of this. What we decided for this unit was to have one capstone lesson. So there's a capstone lesson in this unit, and then the unit also builds in a little bit of time for students to go back and address the course compelling question, which they've been tracking throughout the course. So the capstone compelling question is 19th century America a story of progress? And then again, students are going to come back at the very end and address the course compelling question, which is, how should we tell the stories of America? So the guided tour of the unit starts with that capstone lesson. So in this lesson, students are addressing the question about whether America was a story of progress over the course of the 1800s. You'll notice there are quite a few big ideas for this lesson because it's synthesizing a lot of learning over the course of really the whole year for students, but certainly the last several months. One big idea I do want to point out in here is that one of the first things we talk about with students in this lesson is that many people describe America's history as one of continual progress. However, some historians challenge that idea and argue that progress is not always continual, that sometimes a nation has setbacks where it actually regresses rather than moves forward, and at other times it just maintains the status quo. So that is something put in front of students right away. Students also in this lesson revisit some of the nation's ideals that they've learned about over the course of the year. So they revisit ideals like liberty, justice, and equality, and they think about using those to measure the nation's progress. And again, they're focusing on these key areas. So they're looking at territory, they're looking at population, national transportation, they're looking at policies for economic growth, looking at the Industrial Revolution. They're looking at how African Americans are treated throughout the 1800s. They're looking at indigenous peoples, and then they're looking at women and how women were treated. These, of course, you can see all parallel that standard, which I'll just flip back to for a second. You'll notice these parallel those same points. Okay, so as students dive into this lesson, it is a 3-day lesson. I think you can see why it would be. So it's a multi-day lesson. And the first thing students do is they brainstorm some initial ideas about whether they think the US has progressed, regressed, or stayed the same over the course of the 1800s. In order to help them make that initial claim, there is some clarification of vocabulary. So you'll see there's a word card for progress, regression, and status quo. And after clarifying these 3 vocabulary words, students do an activity where they actually stand for each statement they agree with. So these are revealed one by one to students, but students look at these and they think, do I agree with that? I believe it's important to vote, for instance. And if they agree, they stand. And at the end of this activity, what students really do is think about whether these are commonly held beliefs. And they will largely probably say yes, right? So voting, the right to express your opinions, being created, the belief that people are created equal, the importance of telling the truth. These are core ideals of the United States. So then students think about, how is it that so many people in the United States agree that these are important ideas? And kids have a chance to really sit and think about the fact that these core ideals, and they do get this handout as part of the lesson, that these really stem from many of our documents in the United States that are regarded as very important to the country. So when we look at these core ideals, these are things that in the United States are generally held by most people. Students next, after they've taken a look at these core ideals and reviewed them, they focus on these as the philosophical basis and architecture for the US government. And they think about the idea that that is why they are commonly held in the United States. These are the philosophical and the philosophical basis for the architecture of the US government. The next thing students do is an activity where they examine excerpts of documents that they've studied this year, and they see if they can identify one of those core values in it. So for instance, in this one, they're looking at an excerpt from Brown versus Board of Education, which is a document they actually have not yet studied this year, but they look at this as an example of a core ideal at work. And it gives also students a chance to look forward from Plessy versus Ferguson and to look forward and see when that was overturned by the Supreme Court. Another example here. So students are taking a look at the 14th Amendment and picking out, what ideals do I see in here? So after examining several excerpts from documents, they then choose 3 ideals that they think are most important to measure the nation's progress. Now, students may bring up a number of different ideals here, and I think there's a chance to have some really healthy discussion with kids, but they will likely bring up equality, justice, liberty, truth, common good. These are core ideals that they have traced over the course of the year. And once students have come to this idea, this agreement as a class about how they are going to measure progress, then they have a chance to really dig in. So students are given this graphic organizer, and you'll notice that the first row, which you're looking at here, is already filled in for them. And you have a chance as the teacher to walk them through this graphic organizer using this model. So the one that's already filled in is for territory. You'll notice there are questions to consider. So these are pre-filled on the graphic organizer to have help students think through what they might recall about whether progress was made. And then there are some notes about what was going on in 1800 and what was going on in 1898. And you'll notice in this one, there are maps. There are also some key points listed. You can encourage students as they work through this graphic organizer to really fill in whatever they think is going to be most helpful. That could be sketches, that could be maps, that could be bullet points. If students are creating this digitally, they can absolutely copy over other maps and digital artifacts. And then at the end, of course, students are taking a look at whether progress was made. And this is a chance for students to make their own assessment. In the model, we've provided a yes and a no. Was progress made? Yes, it was made because of these reasons. No, it was not made because of these reasons. And students can also think about the idea that there might not be a clear yes or no, progress or recession or regression. Maybe there was some progress and some regression, or maybe the status quo was kept. So this is definitely a spot where students can see that there's a spectrum here. And it's not necessarily that the US fell on one far end or one of the spectrum, that they either only made progress or only regressed. So students then have time to work through this graphic organizer, and they work on this together. So they're not just doing this independently. And there is a teacher guide provided for you, because this is a lot to synthesize for the year for the teacher as well. So there's a very thorough teacher guide. I'm just showing you one row of it here that gives you some guidance of what you might help students remember from the year. All of these bullet points are things the students studied in the MC3 course this year. So these were definitely callbacks to prior lessons. And this will help you as you walk around and scaffold students in recalling prior knowledge. And you can hopefully use these to also point them in the direction of what they might remember or what materials they might pull out from prior units as they work. At the end of day one, students do some initial reflective journaling for the lesson question. So they come back to that lesson question, is 19th century America a story of progress? And they write a working claim to that. When they come back on day two, the students actually do a really neat conversations strategy where two people from each group that worked together on day one rotate, so that the new group they've rotated to has some new voices, and they share some of their key points from the graphic organizer. So this is a chance for students to compare and contrast what their group was able to come up with versus other groups, and maybe to add some additional information and layers. After students have rotated through this strategy a couple of different times, each triad, and the conversation strategy has students in triads. Each triad ends up taking one topic, and you can either have them choose, or if it's easier for you, you can assign them. It's up to you, but you do want to make sure all of those topics are covered. And each triad is going to write a 30-second elevator speech to argue whether the US made progress in that area by 1898. So what is your topic? What changes occurred over the course of the 1800s? And what stayed the same? Finally, did the US make progress? So 30 seconds in a nutshell, if you had to tell somebody about what happened over the course of the 19th century, what would you say? So students, after presenting these, on day three, they come together and have a final Socratic Circle discussion, which of course they've done a number of over the course of the year. In this Socratic Circle discussion, they come back to that same question: is 19th century America a story of progress? And also, what core ideals should we use to measure the nation's progress? And again, this gives the students a chance to really think about that spectrum of progress and to think about where the US falls in each of these categories. They come back at the end of the lesson and have some final reflective journaling. So in their We the People journals, they make a final argument to that compelling question with an introduction, a claim, evidence, reasoning, a counter argument. They do a refutation of the counter argument, and they write a conclusion. Lesson has hopefully given students a chance to really think about what they learned over the course of the year and to synthesize it into a final argument. You'll notice there's no new learning in this lesson. This is all them going back and recalling and remembering and critically analyzing what they've already learned this year. So the summative performance task that's included in this unit is the summative performance task for the course. So we're asking students to go back and look at the course as a whole and to look back at the compelling question that they've been tracing. How should we tell the stories of America? So in this final summative performance task, students first are asked to review the prior unit summative performance task. So looking back at their arguments along the course, and then to craft an answer to how we should tell the stories of America. There's a variety of different ways suggested for students to make that final argument. You're not limited to these, but some of the suggestions included are an essay, a podcast, a children's book, a movie trailer, a mural, possibly a course description for the school's course catalog. But we really want students to think about this authentic question: how should we tell the stories of America? The extension that's provided here is for students to conduct an oral history of a friend or family member to collect their story of America. And storycorps.org is provided there. There's a way for them to add that oral history to the collection. So it's an authentic task. And finally, to take informed action, we're asking students to research an event or era from the course that particularly interested them. So to go back and to dig into something that they found really interesting and consider how popular history tells the story of that era. And then to assess what they might add or change to tell a fuller history. And finally, to create a written or oral story of that event or era and share it with classmates. And believe it or not, that's it for Unit 10. So again, it fits into 1 week. It has that capstone lesson and then a chance for students to go back and address the course compelling question. Again, there's a lot of synthesis, a lot of chance for students to discuss and process at the end of the year in this final week. And I know, of course, that final week of the school year is always a busy one, but hopefully this lesson helps you to wrap up that learning in a meaningful way and to move students forward to preview these same areas that they're going to start studying at the beginning of their high school U.S. history course, whatever grade that may fall in. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. That's my email, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks so much for watching and for being here for this series with us. And we are wishing you a wonderful end to the school year and hopefully a relaxing summer.